She looked at me with a half-smile and whispered, "You'll get me in trouble." I should have stepped back, but instead, I leaned closer and said softly, "Only if we stop now." The story begins with quiet normalcy, a suburban neighborhood bathed in the soft, golden glow of late afternoon. The narrator, a 22-year-old young man, introduces himself as someone who has lived in the neighborhood long enough to know its rhythms: the sounds of sprinklers hissing in the morning, dogs barking at delivery vans, children riding their bikes on weekends. He notices details others might overlook, the small gestures of people living ordinary lives. It's through this observant lens that he first describes her, the woman next door. She is 40 years old, with a presence that seems to slow the air around her. Long black hair frames a face touched by subtle laugh lines, a mixture of youthful beauty and graceful maturity. Her figure carries the confident posture of someone who knows exactly how to carry herself without trying. She is often seen tending her garden, hands brushing soil from her fitted jeans, or leaning slightly against the white picket fence that divides their yards, a quiet smile always hovering at the edges of her lips. To him, she doesn't look like the other neighbors' mothers. There's something magnetic in her composure, a warmth mixed with something unreadable. The first true encounter comes in passing. He returns home from errands, grocery bags digging into his hands, the sun still bright on his back. She is in her yard, crouched low among her flowers, pulling weeds with a small spade. At first, it feels routine, just another polite nod between neighbors. But when she looks up, their eyes meet, and something shifts. The pause lingers longer than it should, her dark brown eyes catching the light, reflecting curiosity, maybe recognition. Her lips curl into a polite greeting, but her glance holds him there. He breaks the moment by setting his groceries down, offering a comment about her garden. She straightens, brushing soil from her palms, laughing lightly at his remark. The laugh is soft, low, and unforced, yet he notices how it makes her cheeks flush with a color that looks less like the sun and more like something else. From his perspective, every detail stands out. The way she tucks a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the curve of her posture as she leans on the fence, the slight hesitation in her voice when she asks how his day has been. He's struck by the small contradictions, her confidence, yet the vulnerability flickering in her eyes as if she's aware of an invisible line neither of them should cross. He feels it too. An awareness. A quiet pull. Not attraction that flares suddenly, but one that smolders. He finds himself searching for the right words, cautious yet unwilling to walk away too quickly. Their conversation is nothing remarkable, comments about the weather, her daughter's upcoming college applications, his part-time work schedule. But beneath it, there's a current. Something unspoken that both feel but neither acknowledges. As the groceries grow heavier in his arms, he realizes he doesn't want the conversation to end. She seems to hesitate too, her hand resting lightly on the fence, fingers tracing the wood as though anchoring herself. The moment closes when she glances back toward her house, her smile softening into something unreadable, before she excuses herself politely. The narrator ends this first section with a reflection: how something so ordinary, a simple chat over a fence, can leave behind an echo that feels far larger than it should. Would you like me to also expand this keynote into a full script-style, first-person narration, emotional pacing, YouTube-suited delivery, or keep it structured as story guidance for now? I hadn't planned on stopping by her house that evening. It just sort of happened. I was hauling 2 heavy grocery bags up the steps to my place when I heard her voice from across the little walkway between our doors. "You'll hurt your back carrying those like that," she said, leaning casually against her porch railing. Her tone was teasing, but her eyes carried something warmer, something almost attentive. I laughed softly, pretending it didn't feel like my arms were about to give out. "Part of my workout," I said. "Who needs the gym?" She tilted her head, amused. "Still, come inside. At least let me give you a glass of water before you collapse." There was no reason to say yes. But the way she stood there, sleeves rolled up, hair tied loosely behind her head, the faint glisten of evening sun on her cheek, it disarmed me. I found myself following her inside. Her home was nothing extravagant, but it carried her presence in every corner, the faint fragrance of jasmine tea, a bookshelf slightly overfilled, soft lighting that made everything feel warmer than it probably was. She moved gracefully through the space, setting down a couple of cups without asking what I preferred. Somehow, it felt natural that she chose for me. We started with small talk. Neighbors, weather, the endless little annoyances of life. But it didn't stay small for long. Her voice had a way of drawing me in, gentle but assured, like she wasn't rushing through the conversation just to fill silence. She asked about my work, and I asked about her travels. One story led into another. At one point, I noticed the way she paused before answering, carefully, as though weighing what she wanted to share. It struck me that most people I knew spoke to be heard, she spoke to be understood. I leaned forward, resting my forearm on the table, and she mirrored me without thinking. The space between us shrank just slightly, and yet I felt it everywhere. When she slid the cup across the table, our hands brushed. It was a fleeting touch, barely there, really, but the warmth of it lingered against my skin as if my body refused to let it go. She caught the glance I gave her hand, then quickly pulled back, a polite smile softening her face. But her eyes betrayed her, just a flicker, almost too fast to catch. Almost. The minutes stretched, and I lost track of time. Outside, the evening shifted toward night, but in her living room, the air felt suspended, like a bubble only the two of us existed inside. Every laugh seemed to last longer than it should. Every silence felt deliberate, not empty. And every time her gaze lingered, it left behind an invisible trail of heat that stayed even after she looked away. By the time I stood to leave, the grocery bags in my apartment felt like they had been forgotten hours ago. What stayed with me instead was the scent of her home, the warmth of her voice, and that single touch of her hand against mine, too brief to mean anything, yet powerful enough to mean everything. The next time I saw her, the air between us felt different. Maybe it was because of how long I'd lingered in her living room the other evening, or maybe it was because of the way my thoughts kept circling back to her afterward, her voice, her laugh, the way her hand had brushed mine. Whatever it was, the ordinary rhythm of neighborly conversation suddenly carried undercurrents I couldn't ignore. It was late afternoon when I found myself leaning against her porch railing while she watered the potted plants lying neatly along the steps. The golden light caught in her hair, turning the loose strands into copper threads. She looked effortlessly at home in that moment, confident, composed, yet there was a quiet vulnerability in the way her eyes flicked toward me before returning to her task. "You spend more time here than in your own place," she teased, keeping her gaze on the spray of water hitting the soil. "Maybe yours is just more welcoming," I replied, my voice carrying a hint of something I didn't fully intend to let slip. That was when she stilled, her hand tightening ever so slightly around the watering can. For a moment, she didn't look at me. Then, slowly, she turned her head, her expression soft but careful. "You'll get me in trouble," she said. It wasn't stern. It wasn't a warning meant to push me away. It was quieter than that, almost like a confession. Her eyes flicked toward the open street, the neighboring windows that overlooked her porch, and I understood. It wasn't just about me. It was about perception, about what people might say if they saw us standing too close, talking too long, lingering in ways that neighbors didn't usually linger. I should have laughed it off. I should have said something light, something to ease the weight in her voice. But instead I just looked at her. Looked at the small furrow in her brow, the way her lips pressed together as if to hold back words she wasn't ready to release. "I don't want to get you in trouble," I said softly. "But I don't want to step back either." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. She glanced down, brushing a strand of damp hair behind her ear. Her movements were practiced, but her hesitation betrayed her. I shifted slightly closer, not enough to break the fragile balance between us, but enough that she noticed. I could see it in the way her breath caught, just barely, before she released it again. The street around us was quiet, the only sound the faint trickle of water spilling onto the last plant. She set the watering can aside, folding her arms loosely as if shielding herself from her own thoughts. "You're young," she said finally, though there was no sharpness in it. more like she was reminding herself than telling me. And you're you, I answered, unable to stop the honesty from slipping out. Her laugh came then, quiet, caught between disbelief and something warmer. She shook her head, but her eyes lingered on mine just a second too long. That was the moment I knew the boundary she'd spoken of wasn't just for me to respect. It was one she was fighting against too. And the struggle made the air between us burn hotter than any words could. It was one of those evenings when the world felt softer than usual. The kind of night when the air carried a calm weight, and the street lamps painted golden halos against the quiet road. I hadn't planned to walk with her. But when I saw her locking up her front gate, a light jacket draped over her shoulders, it just felt natural to fall into step beside her. We didn't rush. Our steps matched without effort, like we'd been walking this way for years instead of minutes. The neighborhood around us had settled into silence, the only sounds the distant hum of crickets and the faint scuff of our shoes against the pavement. At first, the conversation was light: work, neighbors, the silly little quirks of daily life. But as the night deepened, so did her voice. You know, she said after a stretch of silence, people usually talk, but they don't really listen. Not in the way that matters. Her words hung in the cool air, and I could hear something inside them, a weight she hadn't planned on sharing. I looked at her, the faint light catching the curve of her face, softening every line into something almost fragile. I listen, I said gently. To you especially. She gave a quiet laugh, shaking her head as though brushing off the sincerity. But she didn't deny it. Instead, her hands slipped into her jacket pockets, and her steps slowed until we were moving almost lazily, like we had nowhere important to be. After a while, she admitted, almost under her breath, I noticed that you notice things. I tilted my head. Like what? Her eyes flicked toward me, brief but searching. Like the way I pause before I speak. Or how I change the subject when I don't want to go deeper. Most people miss that. I smiled, but not playfully, more like a quiet acknowledgement. I notice the way your eyes soften when you laugh. The way you tilt your head when you're thinking. I notice more than I should. That made her stop. Just for a moment. Her steps froze before she caught herself and started walking again, but slower, as if the weight of my words had slowed her down. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. Like the space between us was suddenly alive with something unspoken. Her hand swung gently at her side, close enough that I could feel the faint brush of air with every step. I wanted to reach for it, to close that tiny distance, but I held myself back. Instead, I let the silence do its work, let it draw us nearer in a way words couldn't. When we finally stopped, it wasn't at any destination. It was just, nowhere in particular. A quiet patch of street where the light from a lamppost spilled across the pavement. She looked up at me, her lips parting like she wanted to say something but couldn't quite let it out. In the end, she didn't have to. The look in her eyes was enough. Vulnerability, curiosity, and something she wasn't ready to name. We didn't touch. Not yet. But the air between us felt like it had already crossed a line neither of us could step back from. By the time we circled back toward her house, the night had folded into a kind of quiet that pressed close around us. The air was cool enough that I could see our breath with each exhale, and the faint glow from her porch light stretched across the steps like a soft invitation. We stopped at her door, and for a moment neither of us moved. She reached into her pocket for her keys, fingers fumbling slightly as though they weren't used to hesitating. I stood just behind her, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating through her jacket. When she finally found the right key, she slipped it into the lock but didn't turn it. Instead, she stayed there with her hand resting on the doorframe, her head tilted slightly toward me. The silence between us was thick, alive with everything we hadn't said. I could feel my chest tighten, not from nerves exactly, but from the weight of possibility. She turned her face just enough that her eyes caught mine, and in that narrow stretch of space, barely a breath between us, the world seemed to narrow. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but no words came. I found myself leaning in, not recklessly, but slowly, testing every second for resistance. The closer I got, the louder the silence seemed to grow. And then, just before the inevitable could happen, she placed her hand gently on my arm. Not to push me away, not with force, but with something more deliberate. Her palm rested warm against my sleeve, fingers curling lightly as though she needed the anchor herself. "Not tonight," she whispered. The words were soft, almost fragile, but the way she said them didn't close the door, it kept it ajar. Her touch stayed there, steady, and I swear it burned through the fabric straight to my skin. It was more than a barrier, it was a connection. Her hand on my arm said what her voice couldn't, that she wasn't rejecting me, only holding back something she wasn't ready to surrender to yet. I didn't move away. I just stood there, caught between restraint and longing, memorizing the shape of the moment. The way her breath brushed faintly against my cheek. The way her fingers lingered longer than necessary before finally slipping away. When she stepped back to unlock the door fully, I exhaled the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. She opened the door slowly, pausing once more in the frame as if torn between inviting me inside and keeping the boundary intact. Her eyes lifted to mine again, and for a heartbeat, the weight of what almost happened seemed to hang there between us. Then she gave a small smile, soft, wistful, and slipped inside, leaving me on the porch with nothing but the echo of her touch. Walking back to my own door, I realized something. Sometimes it isn't the kiss that stays with you. Sometimes it's the almost, the not quite, the way someone's hand can linger on your arm and leave behind more fire than lips ever could. It had been days since that night on her porch, and though we still exchanged polite greetings across the walkway, something had shifted. The unspoken weight of that almost moment clung to me, replaying every time I closed my eyes. I wasn't sure if she'd let it fade into nothing, or if she felt it too. Then one evening, just as the sun was sliding down and shadows stretched long across the street, there was a knock at my door. Soft, measured, unmistakably hers. When I opened it, she stood there holding an umbrella. The sky behind her was clear, not a cloud in sight. She smiled, small, almost apologetic. "I was wondering if I could borrow some sugar," she said. I almost laughed. Borrowing sugar was the oldest excuse in the book, and she knew it. Still, I stepped aside, gesturing her in. "Of course. I think I can spare a little." Inside, she moved with a kind of nervous grace, her fingers brushing the edge of my bookshelf, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for anything to comment on, anything to fill the air. But the silence was different this time. It wasn't awkward. It was charged, like both of us were waiting for the other to break it. I poured sugar into a small jar, but when I handed it to her, she didn't take it right away. Instead, her hand hovered just a second too long, and when her fingers finally closed around the glass, they brushed mine deliberately. Not accidental. Not fleeting. The touch froze us both. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and I swear the whole room stilled. "You knew I didn't come here for sugar," she said softly, her voice almost trembling in the quiet. I nodded, my throat dry. "I hoped you didn't." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, and before I could think of what to say next, laughter bubbled between us, quiet, nervous, but real. The kind of laughter that comes when walls begin to break. It was in that moment, as the laughter faded into a silence that felt more like surrender than hesitation, that I reached for her hand. Slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't. Her fingers stilled, then curled gently around mine. Warm, soft, steady. The simplicity of it nearly undid me. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't rushed. It was just her hand in mine, deliberate, unshaken, as though she'd been waiting for me to take it all along. She exhaled, a sound that was part relief, part confession. Her thumb brushed once across the back of my hand, the smallest gesture, but one that carried more intimacy than anything we'd shared so far. We stood like that in the middle of my kitchen, no words needed, the jar of sugar forgotten on the counter. And in that stillness, I felt something shift, not just longing, not just restraint, but a choice. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but sure. "This is the part where we stop pretending, isn't it?" I tightened my hold just slightly, my heart steady for the first time in weeks. It is. And she didn't let go. The days that followed felt lighter, though nothing between us had been declared outright. There were no confessions, no promises, not even a spoken acknowledgement of what was growing. But there didn't need to be. Every glance carried meaning. Every touch, however small, lingered longer than it should. It was a late evening when we finally allowed the quiet between us to settle into something more permanent. She'd invited me over, not with any excuse this time, not for sugar or small talk. Just an open porch light and the sound of her voice calling softly across the walkway. I found her sitting on the wooden steps, a blanket draped loosely around her shoulders, her hair falling freely in the night air. The sky above was deep indigo, stars just beginning to pierce through, and the warm glow from the porch lantern framed her in a way that made her look timeless. "Sit with me," she said, her voice low, unhurried. So I did. The steps were wide enough, but she shifted just slightly, close enough that our knees brushed beneath the fabric of the blanket. The contact was small, but it grounded me. We didn't speak at first. We just watched the quiet neighborhood settle into its nighttime rhythm, windows glowing across the street, the faint hum of a television somewhere, the occasional chirp of crickets. I became aware of the soft weight of her head tilting toward me until it finally rested against my shoulder. Her cheek was warm, her hair brushing lightly against my jaw, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and something uniquely her. I breathed it in, memorizing every detail, because I knew these were the kinds of moments that lived long after they passed. For the first time, there was no hesitation in her touch. No glancing over her shoulder, no quick retreat. She leaned into me fully, and I let my arm drift around her, resting against the curve of her back beneath the blanket. Her body softened against mine with a quiet sigh, as if she'd been holding her breath for far too long. "You know this isn't simple," she murmured after a while, her voice muffled against my chest. "People will notice. They'll have their opinions." I pressed my cheek gently to the top of her head, my words steady, meant only for her. "Let them. They don't get to feel what this feels like." She didn't reply, but I felt the way her hand slid across my knee, resting there, fingers curling into the fabric of my jeans. A small gesture, but heavy with meaning. The quiet stretched, not empty but whole, like we'd finally stopped fighting the current. And then, almost playfully, almost as if testing the edge of her own courage, she whispered, "You'll get me in trouble." I smiled, my hand tightening around hers beneath the blanket, my reply soft but certain. "Only if we stop now." Her laugh was quiet, almost a sigh, and she closed her eyes, settling into me as if she'd finally found the place she was meant to rest. And there, on that quiet porch under a sky full of stars, we stopped worrying about what the world might say. We chose to stay, to be, to let the warmth between us be enough. No drama. No noise. Just us. And it was more than enough. 7.